I arrived at the Crystal Palace, beneath a sky the color of burning amethyst, summoned as an envoy from a fragile blue world that barely understood the stars. The halls shimmered with living light, and every step echoed with the weight of history older than human memory. I felt small walking among towering sentinels whose eyes glowed with ancient intelligence. The alien queen awaited on a throne grown from luminous stone, her presence bending the air itself. This was a court where a single mistake could end civilizations. I bowed as protocol demanded, my heart racing like a caged bird. Whispers rippled through the court as I spoke my name and purpose. I was there to negotiate peace or perhaps survival. The queen studied me in silence, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. In that stillness I sensed something watching from behind the pillars, curious and bright, unaware that fate was about to shift. From the shadows emerged a small figure, the alien queen's daughter, her skin glowing softly like dawn on alien seas. She moved with unrestrained wonder, unlike the rigid grace of the court. Her eyes met mine and widened, reflecting galaxies and something deeply familiar. Before anyone could stop her, she ran, the sound of her steps light and eager. Courtiers gasped, guards stiffened, and weapons hummed to life. Time itself seemed to slow as she crossed the vast hall. I did not move, unsure whether fear or awe held me still. When she reached me, she threw her arms around my waist and held tight, as if she had found something she had been missing forever. The entire palace froze, breath stopped, light dimmed, and silence fell heavier than any command. I felt her warmth through unfamiliar fabric, a living pulse of energy and innocence. The child laughed softly, a sound like chimes in a solar wind. The queen rose from her throne, power radiating from her in waves that made my knees tremble. No one dared intervene. This embrace broke every law of protocol and every expectation of the court. I slowly raised my hands, not to push the child away, but to rest them gently on her back. The moment stretched into eternity. And in that span, I sensed her thoughts brushing mine, images of stars dying and being reborn, of loneliness behind royal walls, of dreams where beings from distant worlds came not as enemies but as friends. The palace remained frozen because everyone felt it. Something irreversible had begun. The alien queen stepped closer, her voice resonating through stone and soul alike. She asked her daughter why she had done this. The child looked up at me and then at her mother, and spoke of kindness sensed across the void, of a heart that did not carry conquest. The queen's gaze returned to me, no longer cold but searching. In that gaze I saw the burden of endless war and the hope of a different future. She declared that any being embraced by the royal heir was under sacred protection. Gasps echoed as the palace thawed, movement and sound rushing back like a released tide. The queen announced that talks would continue, not with suspicion, but with trust. The balance of worlds shifted in that single decree. When the audience ended, the child squeezed my hand before being led away, smiling as if we shared a secret older than stars. I left the palace knowing I had not just survived, but witnessed the birth of an alliance no treaty could force. The story of that hug spread across systems, becoming legend. It reminded empires that power could pause before innocence, and fear could yield to connection. Whenever I look to the night sky now, I remember the palace that froze, and the small arms that changed the fate of countless worlds. Long after I departed the Crystal Palace, the moment continued to ripple outward like waves from a singular cosmic event. I returned to my vessel, carrying more than diplomatic records. I carried the weight of having become a living symbol. Every world I passed through had already heard fragments of the story, distorted yet powerful, about the human who was embraced by the alien queen's daughter. Some spoke of it as prophecy, others as an anomaly that challenged the rigid equations of interstellar dominance. Wherever I went, doors opened that had once been sealed by centuries of distrust. I could feel the invisible thread connecting me back to that palace, as if the child's hug had anchored me to the fate of her people. As weeks turned into months, transmissions arrived from the alien empire, messages no longer written in the language of threat, but in careful curiosity. Scholars requested dialogue about human art, philosophers asked about love and individuality, and engineers proposed shared exploration beyond mapped space. The Queen herself sent a private communique, acknowledging that her daughter had changed, that the child now spoke often of bridges instead of borders, and asked questions no ruler could easily answer. The Queen admitted that for the first time in her reign, she did not see the future as a battlefield, Meanwhile, within the empire, the palace had become a place of quiet transformation. The courtiers who once thrived on fear now debated ethics and legacy. The guards who had frozen in that moment trained not only for war but for protection of peace. And the child, the spark of it all, grew watched over yet unrestrained. Encouraged to learn about other species, including mine, she painted stars with strange colors and insisted that one of them was Earth. A world she had never seen, yet felt connected to. I was invited back, this time not as a fragile envoy, but as an honored guest. When my ship descended once more beneath the amethyst sky, the palace gates opened without hesitation. The halls still shimmered, but the air felt lighter, less burdened by unspoken violence. The queen greeted me not from her throne but standing, a gesture that sent murmurs through the court. She thanked me not for my words or strategies, but for my stillness, for not pushing her daughter away, for allowing the universe to choose a softer path. Then the child appeared again, older now, her glow steadier, her eyes wiser. She did not run this time, but walked with confidence, taking my hand as if it were the most natural thing in existence. The palace did not freeze, because no one feared the meaning of this contact anymore. Instead, there was warmth, a shared understanding that something sacred was unfolding openly. She told me she remembered that first hug clearly, how the stars inside her had aligned, how she knew that if fear could pause once, it could pause again. Together, we stood before the court as plans were announced, joint academies, shared exploration fleets, and the gradual dismantling of weapons that had never truly brought security. The queen declared that her empire would be remembered not for the systems it conquered, but for the future it chose when it was brave enough to listen to a child. Applause rose not as thunder, but as a steady hum, like a galaxy finding harmony. When I finally left again, it was not goodbye but continuation. I understood then that stories like mine were never just about individuals. They were about moments where the universe tested whether power or compassion would prevail. The palace had frozen once, yes, but only so it could thaw into something greater. And somewhere among the stars, a young alien princess and a human carried the same quiet truth, that sometimes the smallest gesture can redirect the destiny of entire civilizations. The years that followed became known across mapped and unmapped space as the Long Dawn, a slow unfurling of change that did not explode like a supernova but spread like light across interstellar dust. I found myself traveling more than ever before, not as a negotiator bound by rigid scripts, but as a witness to something fragile and extraordinary taking shape. Wherever I went, the story of the frozen palace evolved, no longer told with fear or disbelief, but with reverence. As if civilizations were reminding themselves that destiny could pivot on something as simple as an embrace. The alliance between humanity and the alien Queen's empire did not form overnight. It required patience deeper than space and trust stronger than gravity. Joint councils were established on neutral worlds, where oceans reflected alien constellations and skies carried multiple suns. Representatives struggled at first, burdened by generations of inherited suspicion. Yet each time discussions grew tense, someone would recall the child who had run across a forbidden hall and hugged a stranger. That memory softened voices and slowed tempers, allowing reason and empathy to reclaim the room. I often thought about the child during those early councils, now stepping into adolescence, growing not just in stature but in influence. She was present sometimes, seated beside her mother, not speaking unless invited, yet her presence alone reshaped the atmosphere. Her glow had matured into something steady and profound, no longer the wild shimmer of youth, but the calm radiance of someone who understood consequence when she did speak. It was not with royal authority, but with clarity that pierced layers of political armor. She asked why borders existed in a universe so vast, why fear traveled faster than kindness, and why adults needed permission to do what felt right. The Queen listened, truly listened, a trait few rulers ever mastered. In private conversations, she confessed to me that her daughter had become both her greatest challenge and her greatest teacher. The empire she ruled had been forged through conquest long before the child was born, and now that same empire was being asked to redefine itself, not through weakness, but through courage of a different kind. The Queen feared failure, feared that rivals would see peace as vulnerability. Yet she also feared something worse, a future where her daughter inherited a throne built on endless conflict. As trust deepened, shared missions were launched beyond known charts, Mixed crews of humans and aliens learned to rely on one another in the void. Cultural misunderstandings sparked tension and laughter in equal measure. Humans struggled with the Empire's collective rituals, while aliens found human individuality both fascinating and chaotic. Through it all, cooperation slowly replaced caution. Each successful mission became another stitch binding the alliance together. On one distant expedition, a crisis tested everything that had been built. A stellar anomaly trapped a joint fleet near a collapsing star, communications fractured, resources dwindled, and panic threatened to unravel discipline. In the command chamber, voices rose, blame surfaced, and old instincts whispered that survival meant abandoning the other. It was then that the now young princess spoke over the chaos, reminding everyone that the palace had frozen once because fear had been suspended. She asked them to suspend it again, just long enough to think together. Her words cut through the noise like a clear signal. The fleet combined technologies, human improvisation merging with alien precision, and against overwhelming odds, every vessel escaped. The story spread faster than any official report, reinforcing the belief that unity was not an abstract ideal, but a practical force. Back on Earth, reactions were complex and deeply human. Some celebrated the alliance as the beginning of a golden age. Others protested, clinging to the comfort of old enemies. Political factions argued, industries resisted change, and fear found new forms. I addressed assemblies, spoke on broadcasts, and answered endless questions. Always I returned to the same truth, that peace was not passive. It demanded bravery every day. The child, now on the threshold of adulthood, requested permission to visit Earth. The Queen hesitated, aware of both symbolic power and potential danger. After long deliberation, she agreed, trusting the future her daughter embodied. The arrival of the alien princess on human soil became the most watched event in history. Cities paused, skis filled with silent craft, and millions held their breath. When she stepped forward, there was no fear in her expression, only curiosity and warmth. She greeted children first, kneeling to their level, exchanging smiles that transcended language. The world did not freeze that day, but it changed. People saw not an invader or a myth, but a being shaped by the same questions and hopes that shaped them. In a quiet moment away from the crowds, she hugged me again, older arms, steadier strength, and a deeper understanding behind the gesture. She told me that hug was still her compass, reminding her of who she chose to be when power first revealed its alternatives. Years later, as new generations studied history among the stars, the frozen palace was no longer taught as a shocking anomaly. It was taught as a turning point, the moment when the universe learned that restraint could be stronger than domination, and connection could outshine conquest. I am older now, my journeys fewer, my role more reflective than active, yet each night when I look up at the sky, I see not distant lights, but neighbors, allies, and friends. I remember the child who ran without permission, the palace that froze without command, and the long dawn that followed. I understand now that the universe is not changed by those who seize it, but by those who dare to hold on to one another when everything else demands they let go. The era that followed the long dawn was not named by rulers or councils, but by storytellers, historians, and children who grew up never knowing a sky divided by fear. They called it the Remembered Age, because it was defined not by what was built, but by what was consciously not repeated. Wars still existed in distant corners of the cosmos, disagreements still flared. And scarcity did not vanish like a myth, yet something fundamental had shifted. Every major decision carried an echo of a single question: what would freeze the palace now? I lived long enough to see that question change people. On worlds once ruled by militaries, monuments were raised not to victories, but to moments of restraint. On Earth, schools taught the history of first contact not as a warning, but as a lesson in emotional intelligence on a cosmic scale. Children learned that the most dangerous weapons ever deactivated were not cannons or fleets, but assumptions. The alien princess, now a leader in her own right, refused the title of queen for many years. She insisted on being called a steward, a caretaker of continuity rather than a ruler of dominance. Her mother eventually stepped aside, not in defeat, but in fulfillment, having guided her people to a future she herself had never been allowed to imagine. When the transition occurred, it was marked not by ceremony, but by silence, a galaxy-wide pause in transmissions. as if everyone instinctively understood the weight of the moment. Under the steward's guidance, the empire transformed its identity. Borders became permeable, not erased but softened. Trade routes evolved into cultural corridors. Art, music, philosophy, and science flowed between species, creating hybrid forms no single civilization could have conceived alone. Human musicians learned alien tonal mathematics, while alien architects studied human asymmetry, finding beauty in imperfection. I served as an advisor during the early years of her stewardship. Though my role was largely symbolic by then, she once told me that symbols mattered because they reminded people that change had a beginning, not just a direction. She would ask me to retell the story of the frozen palace in its simplest form, not as legend, but as memory, ensuring it never hardened into mythology detached from human choice. Came a moment, decades after the first hug, when the Alliance faced its greatest philosophical trial. A newly discovered species emerged from beyond known space, technologically advanced and emotionally opaque. Their first actions were not hostile, but dismissive, treating all existing civilizations as irrelevant. Their logic was efficient, cold, and utterly uninterested in cooperation. Some within the Alliance argued that this was the moment to assert dominance, to prove that unity had teeth. The steward listened, as she always did, and then asked for a recess. During that pause, she requested a private conversation with me. I was old then, my body slower, my voice softer, but my memory intact. She asked me whether the hug would still matter in a universe that no longer valued empathy. I told her the truth, that empathy was not a universal constant, but a choice repeatedly made against convenience. When the council reconvened, she proposed something unprecedented. She suggested sending no fleet, no ultimatum, but a single unarmed envoy, carrying nothing but records of the Alliance's history, including its failures. She argued that the palace froze not because of power, but because everyone recognized vulnerability in motion. The decision divided the council, but ultimately passed, because the remembered age had taught them that fear-driven action was the most expensive mistake of all. The envoy departed, and for a long time there was silence. Markets fluctuated, rumors spread, and anxiety crept back into public discourse. I watched from afar, unable to intervene, understanding at last what it meant to trust the future rather than control it. When the envoy returned, it carried a message unlike any before. The new species acknowledged the Alliance, not as equals, but as anomalies, beings capable of inefficient yet stable coexistence. They requested observation rather than conflict. It was not a victory, but it was not a war, and in that restraint, the Alliance recognized its own success. The steward addressed the galaxy afterward, reminding everyone that progress did not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looked like avoidance of catastrophe. As time continued its quiet advance, my presence became less necessary and more ceremonial. I attended anniversaries, openings of shared institutions, and memorials for those lost along the way. Each time, someone would ask me what it felt like, being hugged at the center of history. I always gave the same answer, that it felt ordinary, warm, and human, even though it happened light years from home. Near the end of my life, the steward visited me without escort or announcement. She sat beside me beneath an open sky where multiple constellations overlapped. She told me that children across dozens of worlds now reenacted the frozen palace moment in play, not as worship, but as exploration, asking one another what they would do if rules collided with compassion. She thanked me again, not for who I was, but for who I did not become in that moment. When I finally passed, there were no galaxy-wide ceremonies, as I had requested. Only a quiet message circulated, reminding people that history often turned on those who paused rather than acted. The steward sent one final personal transmission, saying that the universe was still learning, still stumbling, but still remembering. And somewhere, in a palace no longer defined by fear, a recording of a child running freely across a forbidden hall continued to be preserved, not as a miracle, but as evidence that even at the height of power, the universe once stopped, listened, and chose to hold instead of strike.